Hello dolls, and welcome back to another video. Whenever I talk about the Beatles or this whole infatuation that the 1960s had with Eastern Indian spirituality and just Eastern spirituality in general, I always talk about the Beatles' trip to India. And whenever I do that, I get questions about making a video all about that very special trip, because when the Beatles decided to spend a couple of weeks in India, it didn't only change them as people, it also changed the music they made. And because the Beatles were so important for music in the late 60s and mid 60s, it really changed the music scene of the time. I wanted this video to focus on a couple of things. So I did my research mainly on what happened there, why did they go there, what was the whole situation. I'm going to speak about their partners who went with them, because some relationships were at critical points, to say the least. Also, of course, the music that they made, the songs that they wrote there, which kind of like styles and influences can be heard on the White Album coming from their time in India, and everything else that is just interesting to know about this very special trip. So let me take you back to February of 1968 in Rishikesh, India, when the Beatles learned everything about Transcendental Meditation and changed the music scene forever. Loss, longing, and the path to India. In August of 1967, the Beatles faced a crisis. Their beloved manager, Brian Epstein, died suddenly, leaving the band directionless and grieving. Epstein had guided their career from obscurity to global fame, and his death created a void. As Cynthia Lennon, John's wife, later observed, with Brian gone, the four needed someone new to give them direction, and the Maharishi was in the right place at the right time. Just days before Epstein's death, the Beatles had attended a seminar on Transcendental Meditation, led by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in Bangor, Wales. There, the Maharishi consoled them upon hearing of Epstein's passing, telling them that Brian's spirit was still with them and encouraging them to think good thoughts for his easy passage, as he referred to it. Paul McCartney recalled, "The Maharishi was great to us when Brian died, offering comfort at a moment when the band desperately needed guidance." Beyond their personal loss, the times were changing. By 1967, the Summer of Love had ushered in an era of hippie counterculture, and many young Westerners were looking east for spiritual fulfillment. Psychedelic drugs had opened the Beatles' minds to new ideas, but the novelty was wearing thin. George Harrison, in particular, had grown deeply interested in Indian music and spirituality over the previous years, having studied sitar with Ravi Shankar and incorporated Indian sounds into songs like Norwegian Wood and Within You, Without You. Now, he and the others sought something more lasting than acid trips, a genuine path to inner peace. As George bluntly put it during this period, "We have all the money you could ever dream of. We have all the fame you could ever wish for. But it isn't love. It isn't peace inside, is it?" This hunger for a deeper meaning set the stage for their journey to India. India held a powerful mystique for the counterculture generation. For many disillusioned young people in the late 60s, India was seen as the farthest point from Western materialism and conflict, a sanctuary of spiritual wisdom. The allure of ashrams, gurus, and ancient philosophies drew thousands along the so-called hippie trail to South Asia in search of enlightenment. As one journalist wrote, "The very idea of India represented a balm for a generation seeking escape from war and convention." The Beatles, the most famous group on the planet, were about to validate that quest in a very public way. Their embrace of Eastern meditation over Western excess even led Life magazine to declare 1968 the year of the Guru, reflecting how rapidly Indian spirituality was becoming mainstream in the West. Their journey would be equal parts pilgrimage and paradox, a retreat into silence that somehow produced one of the loudest creative bursts of their career. What began as a search for peace in the foothills of the Himalayas would ripple outward, reshaping their music, their relationships, and even the cultural landscape of the West. Chapter 1. Journey to Rishikesh, the Beatles' guru and a media frenzy. After months of anticipation, John Lennon, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr finally traveled to Rishikesh, India in February of 1968 to attend an advanced transcendental meditation retreat at the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's Ashram. They did not go alone. The Beatles brought an entourage of their wives and girlfriends, Cynthia Lennon, Pattie Boyd, Maureen Starkey, and Jane Asher, as well as their road managers Mel Evans, Neil Aspinall, and even a few journalists who traveled with them to the foothills of the Himalayas. They joined a larger group of about 60 meditation students from Europe and America, including many famous friends like folk singer Donovan, Beach Boys Mike Love, actress Mia Farrow and her sister Prudence, Patty's sister Jenny Boyd, and jazz flautist Paul Horn. The world's press was fascinated by this eastward turn by the usually cynical Fab Four. Just a short time earlier, John Lennon had scandalized the public by proclaiming the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and he had dismissed religious devotees as thick and ordinary. Yet here were the world's biggest rock stars trekking halfway across the globe to seek spiritual guidance from a Hindu guru. As one journalist marveled that in that February of 1968, quote, a stunned world looked on as pop's reluctant antichrists found themselves chasing a self-proclaimed guru halfway across the globe in search of spiritual guidance. The sight of the Beatles arriving in India, clad in loose-fitting kurtas with beads and sandals, was splashed across newspapers worldwide. It symbolized a remarkable East meets West cultural moment. The ashram itself was located in a serene area near Rishikesh, nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas on the banks of the river Ganges. To reach it, the Beatles party traveled by taxi from Delhi, then crossed a narrow footbridge, the Lakshman Jhula suspension bridge over the Ganges, walking the final stretch up a hill to the Maharishi's gated compound. Despite their global fame, the band sought anonymity and peace here. The ashram was a self-contained little village with stone bungalows, each modestly equipped with running water and basic furniture, where the attendees lived, and a lecture hall decorated with flowers where Maharishi gave teachings. Inside the ashram, the atmosphere was designed to encourage shedding of Western habits. The Beatles and their companions donned traditional Indian clothing, kurtas, loose pajama trousers, and narrow-collared shirts in vibrant colors. They even had garments custom-tailored on-site from Indian fabric. If you go to India, you can't wear Western clothes. That's one of the best bits about India, having these cool clothes, George recalled, referring to the flowing shirts and pantaloons they adopted. Ringo added, we all had Indian clothes made, huge pants, narrow collars. We got right into it. Complete with long hair and garlands of marigold flowers around their necks, would soon be copied by fashion designers back in London, a vivid example of how their Indian adventures set trends. Even as they tried to retreat from the spotlight, the Beatles could not entirely escape notice. The Maharishi recognized their celebrity value and at one point organized a formal group photograph with all the ashram attendees. In that iconic shot taken in February of 1968, the Beatles sit cross-legged in front, dressed in white and draped in orange marigold garlands, with the Maharishi smiling beatifically behind them. It took about half an hour to arrange everyone, and Maharishi cheerfully urged, quote, let everyone outside the ashram see how happy your meditations are making you. The image became famous, one of the most iconic photographs in the history of rock and roll, as one newspaper later described it. It adorned the walls of countless young people, symbolized a hopeful vision of cross-cultural harmony, and a promise of spiritual peace in a turbulent world. Chapter 2. Life at the Maharishi's Ashram, Meditation and Monkeys. Once settled in Rishikesh, the Beatles set out on their ashram routine, at least at first. Days began early with meditation sessions at dawn, followed by simple vegetarian meals, more meditation or lectures, and free time in the afternoon for music or relaxation. The Maharishi's lectures took place on a flower-bedecked platform, where he would impart spiritual wisdom and practical guidance in transcendental meditation. Due to the Beatles' late arrival, the Maharishi even gave them a few private tutoring sessions to catch them up. He soon encouraged all his students to meditate as long as possible and cancelled some of the formal lectures, urging everyone to dive deeper into the practice. Attendees responded with marathon meditation sittings. One student reportedly meditated for 42 hours straight, and even Patty Boyd, George's wife, once meditated for 7 hours in a stretch. Such intense practice sometimes led to unstressing, as it was called, moodiness or hypersensibility as buried emotions bubbled up. The Beatles experienced this varying intensity each in their own way, with varying degrees of commitment. As observers noted, some of the band members were more disciplined about the meditation than others, and this would soon reveal fault lines among them. George Harrison, not surprisingly, was the most earnest devotee. He truly believed in Maharishi's message and dived into hours of meditation. George grew a full beard, spent time studying Indian scriptures, and gently chided others if they slacked. "We're not here to talk about music or anything," he admonished at one point. "We're here to meditate." John Lennon joked that the way George is going, he'll be flying a magic carpet by the time he's 40, teasing George's zeal for spiritual practice. John himself started out as an enthusiastic convert. Earlier that fall, he had been, quote, evangelical in his enthusiasm for the Maharishi, according to Cynthia. In Rishikesh, John meditated diligently for periods. He claimed up to 8 hours a day at times, yet he also struggled internally with restlessness and later disillusionment. Paul McCartney treated the experience a bit more like a vacation, mixed with a cultural adventure. He meditated and attended sessions, but being a natural pragmatist, Paul was also keeping an eye on the outside world. He would ultimately leave before the others to attend to business. And then there was Ringo Starr, ever the down-to-earth soul, who truly had the hardest time adapting, due in part to mundane issues like food and health, and he ended up being the one who left the earliest, after just 10 days. Those differences quickly deepened into a fault line. Paul and Ringo, practical and grounded, were both settled into domestic life, at least for now. Paul engaged to Jane Asher and Ringo a young father, and they treated India as a passing interlude, meaningful but not life-changing. I also read a lot that Ringo and Maureen were missing their children really badly, and that is why they decided to leave early. I think it's just important to understand that the Beatles were at different points in their lives. George Harrison had been really interested into this meditation journey before they even arrived. John was kind of on the verge of breaking off his marriage. He was really struggling with his marriage. Cynthia was struggling with the marriage. They just weren't happy. And I know it's kind of weird because obviously Maureen and Ringo's marriage wasn't great, and Jane and Paul also broke up kind of soon after this, but it's important to understand that there were several reasons why John and George were a lot more open to the idea and a lot more invested in learning everything about transcendental meditation than Ringo and Paul, who simply didn't feel that deeply connected to it. But as said, John and George were at far more unsettled crossroads. John consumed by his spiritual hunger that nothing in the West seemed to satisfy, and John restless in his failing marriage and searching for direction after Brian Epstein's death. For them, the meditation was not pastime, but a lifeline. This divide between those who saw Rishikesh as a brief episode and those who saw it as a spiritual calling mirrored the points in their lives that they each occupied, and it foreshadowed the widening rift within the band itself. Food at the ashram became a famous point of contention, especially for Ringo. Meals were simple vegetarian fare served in an open-air dining area. Lentil dal, spiced vegetables like eggplant and potato, locally baked wheat bread, rice, and occasional Western staples like cornflakes for breakfast. The communal dining hut had its own mischievous visitors, monkeys and crows that would swoop in to steal food if one wasn't careful. Accounts differ on the taste. Some found the dishes delicious, others too spicy or too bland. John grumbled that the food was lousy, whereas Patty Boyd thought it was delicious. For Ringo, though, it was largely inedible, due to his sensitive stomach and allergies. Years of childhood illness had left Ringo with dietary restrictions. He couldn't eat many spices. Anticipating trouble, he famously arrived in India with a suitcase packed with tins of Heinz baked beans and eggs to sustain him. "The food was impossible for me because I'm allergic to so many different things," Ringo said of his predicament. "So I took 2 suitcases with me, one of clothes and one of Heinz beans." Despite these precautions, Ringo grew uncomfortable and fell ill from either a reaction to a vaccination or the climate. After about 10 days, Ringo and Maureen decided to cut their stay short and head home. On March 1st, 1968. He later joked that he left because I ran out of beans, a typically wry Ringo quip. In truth, Ringo missed his young children and the comfort of his home, and India's bugs, mosquitoes in particular, also bothered him. Leaving early was a relief for him and his wife. For those who remained, the daily life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Mornings were used for meditation by the river or in the cool hills. Afternoons often found the musicians upstairs on the roof of George's bungalow, sitting cross-legged with guitars gently strumming and sharing new song ideas, while gazing out at the Ganges flowing below. George sometimes plucked a sitar in these jam sessions, while others stuck to their acoustic guitars. Meanwhile, the Beatles' partners, Cynthia, Patty, Maureen, and Jane, would often gather together in one of the bungalows to sip tea and share conversation about their lives as Beatles' wives outside of the limelight. There was a lovely camaraderie in those moments, a sense that the group was bonding in a way that they really never hadn't during the frenzy of Beatlemania. One highlight of the Ashram's leisure hour was the presence of Donovan, the gentle-voiced Scottish folk singer. Donovan became sort of a musical guru for the group. He taught them a finger-picking guitar technique, sometimes called Travis picking, that they were eager to learn. Both John Lennon and George Harrison picked it up quickly, and it soon began to appear in the songs they were composing. Donovan's influence is evident in John's delicate ballad Julia and the dreamy ode Dear Prudence, both of which feature the intricate finger-picked guitar style introduced in Rishikesh. In the relaxed setting, the Beatles were also listening to the music that inspired them. One favorite was Bob Dylan's new album, John Wesley Harding, a return to a simpler, more acoustic style, which they heard for the first time in Rishikesh. The sparse, rootsy sound of that Dylan record stood in stark contrast to the Beatles' own psychedelic extravaganzas of 1967, and it nudged them towards a more back-to-the-basic approach in their new songs. And new songs were coming fast and furious. Freed from touring, drugs, and studio pressures, John, Paul, and George all found their creative floodgates open during their stay in the ashram. Quote, I was going humming and strumming in my head and the songs were coming out. For creating, it was great. It was just pouring out, John later said, of this extraordinarily fertile period. By his own account, quote, we wrote about 30 new songs between us. Paul must have done about a dozen. George says he got 6, and I wrote 15. Ringo even chipped in his first ever complete song composition. In the serene atmosphere, he finished writing a country-flavored tune he'd been tinkering with for years, which would later become Don't Pass Me By on their next album. This creative outpouring in just a few weeks is staggering. As one author noted, the Beatles' time in India was also the most productive period for the Beatles' songwriting in their entire career. Many of the tracks written in India would later be released on the Beatles' self-titled album, The Beatles, better known as the White Album. Chapter 3, Songwriting in Rishikesh, The Seeds of the White Album. Cut off from the distractions of Beatlemania, the band found inspiration in the strangest places. Experiences of ashram life directly inspired lyrics and stories in their new songs. Often the Beatles would share these songs in progress with each other in acoustic campfire sessions, giving feedback or even co-writing bits. By the end of the retreat, they had a large batch of songs, some humorous, some heartfelt, some utterly unlike anything they'd written before. At least 18 new compositions from India would eventually make it onto the White Album, with a few others saved for future projects. So let's take a look at some of the wonderful songs that were written in India. Starting with a personal favorite of mine, Dear Prudence. John Lennon wrote this lullaby-like song for Prudence Farrow, Mia Farrow's younger sister. Prudence had become so intent on meditation that she rarely emerged from her cottage, determined to find God faster than anyone else. John, concerned that she might be isolating herself too much, penned Dear Prudence as an invitation for her to come out and play and enjoy the sunshine. She'd been locked in for 3 weeks and was trying to reach God quicker than everyone else, John remarked. The The song's gentle, coaxing refrain and vivid nature imagery reflected the idyllic surroundings and the friendly concern John felt. Happily, Prudence Farrow did complete the course and later said she was touched by the song. She even became a Transcendental Meditation teacher herself after the Beatles had already left. Another exquisitely composed song was Julia, and it showcased the finger-picking guitar style taught by Donovan. Lyrically, Julia is deeply personal, an ode to John's mother Julia, who had died when he was a teenager, intertwined with references to John's new love interest Yoko Ono, whom he would pursue upon returning home. In the song, John sings of an ocean child, which is the literal meaning of the name Yoko. The meditative environment in Rishikesh most likely gave John the reflective space to write this tender and poetic piece, his way of soul-searching through music. Paul later praised Julia as one of John's loveliest songs, and it stands out on the White Album for its intimacy. But not every moment in Rishikesh was a bliss. John suffered from bouts of insomnia and apparent withdrawal, not from drugs per se. The Beatles had vowed to give up LSD when they aligned with the Maharishi, but perhaps more from the turmoil of his personal life. At night he would lie awake thinking about Yoko Ono, with whom he was now infatuated, and feeling frustrated in his marriage and the regimented lifestyle of the ashram. The result was I'm So Tired, a raw, plaintive song John wrote in one of those sleepless nights in India. It captures his restlessness and itching boredom and the long, sleepless nights. He directly addresses Sir Walter Raleigh in the song, cursing the man who introduced him to tobacco, in a wry nod to smoking as his one remaining vice during meditation. Even though they technically weren't allowed to do so, John was reportedly sneaking in cigarettes in Rishikesh. I'm So Tired is drenched in lethargy and irritation, reflecting that even in paradise, John could feel impatient and trapped. Another Lennon composition, Year Blues, was shockingly bluesy and intense. Ironically, John wrote it while at the supposedly spiritually uplifting retreat, yet the long screams of despair feel so suicidal, just like Dylan's Mr. Jones. In Rishikesh, John was confronting his inner demons in the silence of meditation, and at times he felt depressed. Although it was very beautiful and I was meditating about 8 hours a day, I was the most miserable on earth, he later admitted of that period, though he noted that the songs that came out of it were some of my very best. Year Blues channels that darkness in a loud, exaggerated form. John basically wrote a mock blues to express that even being with the guru couldn't instantly fix all his troubles. It's a raw, cathartic track that showed the Beatles heading in a heavier direction musically, far from the whimsical psychedelia of 1967. In contrast, Paul McCartney drew on the peace and beauty of the environment for his gentle acoustic song. Mother Nature's Son was directly inspired by one of the Maharishi's lectures on the unity of man and nature. Paul felt particularly moved after the Maharishi spoke about everyone being a child of nature, and he wandered off to sit quietly with his guitar, writing lyrics about the simple joy of sitting by a stream and listening to the earth sing. The result is a gorgeous, pastoral song brimming with the influence of India's natural setting. One can almost imagine Paul perched on a hillside at dusk, crafting this ode to the nature around him. Don't Pass Me By is a country-flavored homespun tune that showed Ringo's own songwriting voice. It was Ringo Starr's first ever solo composition to make it onto a Beatles record. Ringo had carried the title and a simple chorus line for years, as early as 1964 as he noodled with a song by this name. But he finally finished writing it at the ashram. Perhaps the supportive atmosphere and having more free time while others wrote prolifically encouraged Ringo to complete the piece. The fact that even Ringo wrote a song in India underscores just how creatively charged the Beatles were during this retreat. Paul's knack for writing catchy tunes didn't abandon him in India. He worked on Obla Di Obla Da, a bouncy, calypso-inflected song during the retreat. The title phrase came from a Jamaican acquaintance in London. While the song's ska rhythm and light-hearted lyrics about Desmond and Molly Jones don't scream India, it was indeed developed there, showing that not everything the Beatles wrote had to be about their immediate surroundings or deep philosophy. Sometimes a good tune is a good tune, even if it's a bit of escapist fun. Fun fact, the others grew infamously irritated with this song during recording, but it became a hit single in many countries when released. And this might be surprising to many, but the raucous rock and roll parody of the Beach Boys and Chuck Berry titled Back in the USSR was also largely written in Rishikesh. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, who was a fellow meditator there, later recalled that he had chatted with Paul about doing a Beach Boys-style bridge for the song, suggesting the Georgia's always on my mind line, referencing the US state of Georgia and the Soviet Republic of Georgia as a pun. The song itself, a witty spoof of American rock trope songs from a Soviet youth's perspective, shows that even in the quiet of the ashram, Paul's satirical and upbeat imagination was working. Back in the USSR would open the White Album with a roar of a jet engine, a world away from the peace at Rishikesh, yet born out of that very experience of stepping outside the Western world for a moment. John's songwriting was often directly inspired by the events around him. The continuing story of Bungalow Bill, a quirky music hall meets folk sing-along, was inspired by a real incident at the ashram. An American student, often dubbed Bungalow Bill, while he was actually named Richard A. Cook III, had briefly left the camp to go tiger hunting with his mother, and he shot a tiger. He then returned to the ashram as if nothing happened, which John found absurd and darkly comic. Bungalow Bill became John's satirical take on the story. All the children sing the chorus in a campy way, and even Yoko Ono, who had by then entered John Lennon's life, would later sing a line on the recording. The song, written in India right after the tiger hunt tale circulated, pokes fun at the clash of violent adventure and spiritual seeking. As John described it, it was inspired by the son of an American student who went hunting in the jungle during the retreat. And then there was Why Don't We Do It in the Road? Paul contributed this brief, cheeky blues stump after observing two monkeys mating openly on a roadway in the ashram. The sight stuck him as a symbol of natural freedom, uninebriated and innocent. Amused, Paul quickly wrote the simplest of lyrics. Why don't we do it in the road? Repeated and repeated and repeated, to celebrate the idea of unself-conscious love. He recorded it back in England as basically a solo performance, but its spirit was born in India. Paul later said the song was an innocent joke, but it does reflect how even monkeys at the ashram provided creative fodder. As noted in the ashram song list, it was inspired by monkeys mating in the road outside their bungalows. Sexy Sadie is perhaps the most infamous song to come out of the India trip. John wrote this scratching tune as things turned sour at the end. Originally, he titled it Maharishi, and the lyrics lambasted the guru for allegedly failing the Beatles' expectations. Sexy Sadie, what have you done? You made a fool of everyone. John sneers in the song. Lines that were initially directed at Maharishi himself. The title Sexy Sadie was a later substitution to avoid libel at George Harrison's urging when they recorded it for the White Album. The genesis of the song came in the final hours of the Beatles' stay, literally as they were packing to leave. John scribbled the song in anger while waiting for a taxi. Its biting tone captures the disillusionment and feeling of betrayal John experienced, rightly or wrongly, regarding the Maharishi's behavior. Sexy Sadie stands as a bitter bookend to what began as a journey of hope, but more on that later. This remarkable array of songs, from gentle folk ballads to proto-heavy metal blues to goofy rock ditties, all sprouted during these few weeks in Rishikesh. Many of the tracks would end up on the Beatles' self-titled double LP, which thanks to its plain white cover would later be known as the White Album. In retrospect, it's clear the India retreat had a profound influence on that album's content. From the acoustic back-to-basic feel of many songs to the spiritually infused lyrics and unconventional inspirations, the White Album bears the imprint of Rishikesh on almost every side. As one historian noted, the importance of the Beatles' trip to India in early 1968 and its eventual influence on what was to become the White Album cannot be overemphasized. It was a turning point away from the psychedelic studio tricks of Sgt. Pepper and toward a more electric, raw, and introspective approach, one that would influence generations of musicians. Chapter 4: Meditation, Mirage and Maharishi, Discord and Departure. For all the creativity and camaraderie, the Beatles' time in India was not without tension and doubts. As the weeks passed, fault lines emerged. Without the buffer of drugs or the bustle of their old schedule, underlying personal issues came into sharper focus. Was John and Cynthia's relationship. Cynthia truly enjoyed the peacefulness of Rishikesh and hoped it would be a chance to rekindle her bond with John far away from the chaos of the Beatle life. I loved being in India, she said, recalling that she hoped John and I would rediscover our lost closeness in the serene setting. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. John grew increasingly distant and cold toward his wife, caught up in his own spiritual and artistic quest and distracted by thoughts of Yoko back in London. John hardly paid Cynthia attention. Midway through the retreat, he even asked to move out of the shared bedroom with Cynthia, claiming he could meditate better alone. Each morning, John would walk down to the local post office, ostensibly for exercise, but in truth it was to check for telegrams from Yoko Ono. Yoko was sending him tender, cryptic messages from afar, such as, "Look up at the sky, and when you see a cloud, think of me." John was clearly emotionally entangled with Yoko by now, signaling the beginning of the end of his marriage to Cynthia. This personal drama cast a bit of a shadow for Cynthia, who later said she was deeply disappointed to leave India without the closeness I had hoped for. Meanwhile, aside from Ringo's early exit, Paul McCartney also decided to leave India before the course was fully over. After about a month, near the end of March, Paul and Jane Asher departed. Officially, Paul said he had to return to London for some business commitments, notably to oversee the Beatles' new multimedia venture, Apple Course, which was getting underway. Privately, Paul likely felt like he had gotten what he needed from the experience and was eager to get back to work recording and managing the band's affairs. He enjoyed India, but did not share John or George's desire to stay indefinitely. "I meditate when I get back home," Paul shrugged, and indeed, he did continue Transcendental Meditation back in England, but more on his own terms. Paul's departure left only John and George and their wives remaining with the Maharishi into early April of 1968. For a time, John and George were content to continue. They celebrated George's 25th birthday at the Ashram on February 25th with a cake, candles, and even fireworks provided by the Maharishi. The Maharishi presented George with a special gift, a globe of the world, but positioned upside down. He told George that it symbolized how the world was today and said, "I hope you will help us all in the task of putting it right." George playfully spun the globe right side up and exclaimed, "I've done it," to laughter. It was a moment of genuine affection between George and his guru. George fondly nicknamed him the Big M. The Maharishi also flattered the Beatles as the blessed leaders of the world's youth, a description that actually made Paul a bit uncomfortable. Indeed, one long-time Transcendental Meditation devotee at the camp, Nancy Cook the Herrera, quietly warned the Maharishi not to give the Beatles too much special attention or adulation, lest it inflate their egos and cause friction. As the course went on into March and April, a few cracks began to appear. One issue was Maharishi's growing celebrity and possible commercial aims. The Beatles noticed that Maharishi seemed eager to leverage their presence. Reports filtered in that he was negotiating a lucrative deal for a US television special featuring the Beatles and himself. This alarmed the band's friend and Apple aide Peter Brown, who even flew to meet the Maharishi and asked him to tone down the PR. Brown recalled Maharishi just giggled at the request, not really understanding the Beatles' concerns. George had defended Maharishi, saying he's not a modern man, he just doesn't understand these things, meaning the guru was naive about the media exploitation meditation. Still, the feeling crept in that perhaps they were being used as poster boys for Transcendental Meditation. Financial matters also raised eyebrows. Each student had been asked for a week's wages as a donation to learn Transcendental Meditation. The Beatles quietly paid far more than most people's wages, and Maharishi's organization was rumored to be seeking large contributions. John publicly defended the donation practice at first. "It's the fairest thing I've ever heard of," he said, noting that we're the most commercial group in the world, so what if he is commercial? But privately, the band grew wary of any money talk or grand schemes that emerged. And then came the breaking point. In early April of 1968, shocking stories began circulating among the Westerners at the ashram. Allegations that the Maharishi had made inappropriate sexual advances towards some female students, including perhaps Mia Farrow. Accounts vary. Some say the Maharishi overly flattered or tried to kiss Mia, while others say that this was just a rumor amplified by the Beatles' friend Magic Alex, who had arrived and was mistrustful of the Maharishi. Decades later, many, including George and Mia Farrow's sister Prudence, said the allegations were baseless or a misunderstanding. But nonetheless, John Lennon and George Harrison believed something untoward had happened and felt betrayed and angry. Around the same time, disputes arose over money. One story, possibly apocryphal, claimed the Maharishi asked for a large chunk of the Beatles' next album profits for his foundations, which upheld John. The combination of these issues led to a sudden decision: the Beatles would leave. Late at night on April 11th of 1968, John and George, along with Magic Alex, sat in their bungalow venting about their disillusionment. In that conversation, to get out immediately the next morning, they hastily packed their bags, leaving behind clothes and souvenirs in their rush, and tasked Mel Evans and Alex with arranging taxis for dawn departure. Before leaving, John felt he needed to confront the Maharishi. As John later recounted, he was chosen as the one to speak for the band. In the morning, John and a tense group of Beatles approached Maharishi to inform him they were going. Maharishi asked why. He perhaps sensed something was wrong. John, brimming with sarcasm and disappointment, bluntly answered, "If you're so cosmic, you'll know why. In other words, figure it out yourself." It was a cutting remark, essentially accusing the all-knowing guru of either knowing his guilt or knowing their reasons. Accounts diverge on how the Maharishi reacted. Some say he simply replied, "I don't know why, you must tell me." Appearing genuinely perplexed, Magic Alex later claimed the Maharishi retorted, "I am only human," which, if true, could either be an admission or just a humble deflection. In any case, John was not interested in a debate. The group proceeded to leave the compound. Cynthia Lennon recalled the Maharishi standing by, looking very biblical and isolated in his faith, as this little exodus took place. The Maharishi reportedly called out, "Wait, talk to me," as they walked out, but no further discussion happened. The hastily arranged taxis wound down the roads from Rishikesh, and in a final twist of irony, one taxi after another broke down. This bizarre series of mishaps caused John and the others to nervously joke about the fact that maybe the Maharishi had put a curse on them for leaving. John and Cynthia's taxi got a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. The driver went to fetch a replacement and disappeared for hours, stranding them. Finally, as night fell, Cynthia and John hitchhiked with a passing truck to get back to Delhi. It was an almost farcical end to their journey. On the flight back to London, a relieved and possibly inebriated John Lennon reportedly unleashed a torrent of confessions to Cynthia, admitting to numerous infidelities during their marriage. This was essentially the death knell of John and Cynthia's relationship. Within weeks, John would be inseparable from Yoko Ono, and Cynthia's hopes were definitely dashed. George and Patty, however, did not immediately return to England. Feeling awkward about the abrupt walkout, they took a detour to visit some friends in South India. They spent some time with Ravi Shankar in Madras, Chennai, and then in Bombay, where George composed some music for film. However, George fell ill with dysentery shortly after leaving Rishikesh, and in his feverish state, he would even wonder fleeting if perhaps karma or the Maharishi spell was at work. Ravi Shankar gave George some protective amulets and medication and medicinal help, and George recovered. He later said that he hadn't planned to stay in India for the full 3-month course anyway. He needed to go back to work like Paul did, and he suspected John was anxious to return to Yoko Ono. The India adventure was finally over. Back in London, the press swarmed to find out why the Beatles had left the Guru's compound ahead of their schedule. The Beatles gave diplomatically vague answers at first. John and George told reporters in Delhi they had urgent business in London, and also that they did not want to appear in the Maharishi's film. Maharishi had begun filming scenes for a promotional movie, and the Beatles didn't really want to be part of that anyway. However, once safely home, the gloves came off. The band's sudden about-face dealt a blow to Maharishi's public image. After all, he had been touted as the Beatles guru, and now the Beatles were denouncing him. John especially did not hold back. On a May 1968 appearance on The Tonight Show, guest hosted by John Gargiola, John spoke out. "We believe in meditation, but not in the Maharishi and his scene," he said of the India trip. "We made a mistake. He's human like the rest of us." Paul McCartney, typically a little more tactful, told reporters that linking up with the Maharishi had been a public mistake, implying they shouldn't have been so high profile about it. The media had a field day with the story of the Beatles falling out with their guru. It cast a temporary shadow on Transcendental Meditation's momentum in the West, and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's image took a hint as skeptics said, "I told you so." Interestingly, another narrative later spun from the Maharishi's camp, that the Beatles hadn't left voluntarily at all, but had essentially been asked to leave. Decades later, Transcendental Meditation proponents like Deepak Chopra suggested that the Beatles had broken the strict no-drugs rule at the ashram. Allegedly, they snuck in some cannabis or even LSD, and when the Maharishi found out, he scolded them and they left in a huff. This account is really hard to verify, and the Beatles have never mentioned being expelled. Nonetheless, it does show the lingering complexity in this exact situation and the fact that no one really knows what caused the rift. In truth, it was most likely a combination of factors: misunderstandings, unmet expectations, external influences like Magic Alex stirring in the pot, and the Beatles' own shifting priorities. But one thing was certain: the Rishikesh retreat was the last time all 4 Beatles would travel together as a band abroad. In the coming year, their unity would fray, and by 1970, the Beatles would break up. The differences in commitment that surfaced in India, George's lifelong spiritual devotion versus the others' more temporary interests, John's all-or-nothing emotional swings, Paul's pragmatic focus on business, and Ringo's unpretentious need for comfort, all foreshadowed the group's eventual dissolution. In a sense, the India trip was a microcosm of the Beatles' strengths and troubles. Incredible collaborative creativity on one hand, but growing personal divergence on the other. Chapter 5. Legacy. East meets West and the Music Revolution. Despite the dramatic end, the Beatles' journey to India left an indelible mark on music and culture. In the short term, it produced a trove of songs that became the White Album, an album revered for its artistic scope and influence on rock music. It's not an overstatement to say that without Rishikesh, the White Album, and even parts of Abbey Road and various solo albums would have been very different. The band members tapped into new creative wells within themselves during meditation. Years later, John Lennon reflected that even though they parted ways with the Maharishi, he valued the meditation experience as a source of creative inspiration for the rest of his life. Indeed, after India, all 4 Beatles continued to meditate at times. George Harrison especially remained a champion of Eastern spirituality and music. He almost single-handedly brought awareness of Indian philosophy into Western pop culture. The concept of meditation as a mainstream practice in the West can be traced in part to 1968 when the Beatles put it on the front page of every newspaper. As one author put it, the Beatles' Rishikesh trip may have been the most momentous spiritual retreat since Jesus spent those 40 days in the wilderness. It sounds grandiose, but consider how many millions became curious about Transcendental Meditation after seeing the Beatles do it. The band's public endorsement of Transcendental Meditation sparked an explosion of interest in Eastern spiritual practices across Europe and America. In time, the hurt feeling between the Beatles and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi also healed. Western attitudes toward Indian spirituality indeed shifted in the Beatles' wake. Yoga, meditation, chanting, concepts that had been fringe or exotic, started to enter everyday vocabulary. The year 1968 saw gurus and swamis pop up on magazine covers. Young people flocked to learn meditation. Though the Beatles later distanced themselves from the Maharishi personally, they validate the core idea that inner peace and enlightenment could be found outside the Western paradigm of drugs and material success. The world of rock music, too, expanded its horizons. After George's earlier introduction of the sitar and pop, the full embrace of Indian culture by the Beatles made it cool for musicians to incorporate world music elements and spiritual themes. The fusion of East and West accelerated. Artists like the Rolling Stones, the Byrds, Donovan, and later Led Zeppelin all dabbled in Eastern scales, instruments, or mysticism in their music. The Beatles had kicked that door wide open for everyone. As Donovan said, the Beatles were looking for a guide and found the Maharishi, and through them countless others were guided to explore Indian music and wisdom. In India itself, the Beatles' visit did not go unnoticed either. It was a point of pride for many in India's youth that the Beatles, the world's top band, had come seeking wisdom in their country. Indian musicians were influenced by the Beatles' experimental sounds, just as the Beatles were influenced by the Indian music. As actor Kabir Bedi recalled, quote, "They moved beyond the rhyming lyrics. They gave us guitar compositions combined with the sounds of soul and folk. They had amazingly creative orchestrations. These new sounds influenced many musicians in India. The cross-influencing of culture flowed both ways." In time, the hurt feeling between the Beatles and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi also healed. The allegations of impropriety that had driven John and George away were later doubted by the Beatles themselves. George Harrison in the 1990s publicly apologized for how he had treated the Maharishi, admitting we were very young, and that, historically, there's the story that something went on that shouldn't have, but nothing did. Both George and Paul made peace with the Maharishi in later years. In 1992, George even played a benefit concert for Maharishi's organization, and in 2007, Paul McCartney visited the Maharishi in the Netherlands to renew their friendship. When the Maharishi died in 2008, Paul spoke kindly of him as a great man who worked tirelessly for the cause of unity. And Ringo thanked him for the lifelong gift of meditation. Quote, "He gave me a mantra that no one can take away, and I still use it." Yoko Ono, for her part, noted that John ultimately came to appreciate the Maharishi's impact, saying, "John would have been the first one now, if he had been here, to recognize and acknowledge that what Maharishi had done for the world and appreciate it." In the end, time vindicated the spiritual search the Beatles undertook. The guru was human, yes, but the meditation practice itself proved enduring and beneficial. Today, the site of the Rishikesh Ashram is often called the Beatles Ashram. Abandoned for years, it was reclaimed and opened to tourists in 2015 due to ongoing global interest. Pilgrims, musical and spiritual alike, wander the ruins of the meditation hall and bungalows, imagining John, Paul, George, and Ringo strumming guitars on a rooftop or sitting in lotus position under the Indian sun. Graffiti tributes cover the crumbling walls. The Beatles in India has become the stuff of legend, a chapter in the band's story that symbolizes the height of the 1960s idealism, the bridging of culture, and the transformative power of music and spirituality. The Beatles' 1968 India trip was groundbreaking for them and for music in general. Personally, it gave the Beatles new artistic direction at a critical time, helping them process loss and find a well of creativity that resulted in one of the greatest albums of all time. Culturally, it announced that pop music could be more than entertainment. It could be a vehicle for exploring consciousness and global traditions. As the Beatles sang in one of the mantras they learned, Jai Guru Deva, victory to the divine teacher. And across the universe, they were paying homage to the idea that wisdom no national boundary. The West's most famous rock band had journeyed east in search of meaning, and in doing so, they inspired a generation to look beyond their horizons, to new sounds, new philosophies, and a new sense of unity through music. Their time in India remains a shining example of East meeting West in a harmonious burst of creativity. a moment when rock and roll sought enlightenment and, in many ways, found it. So that is it for today's video. That is it for the Beatles in India. As said, this is a video I have been wanting to make for such a long time because it's so important to understand the late 1960s, all these influences, the Beatles and everything. And I don't know, I really wanted to share about this. Most of this comes from different biographies that I have read. I can highly encourage you to read Patty Boyd and Cynthia Lennon's biographies if you want to know about this time from an outsider's insider's perspective. Since none of the Beatles have written autobiographies, this is kind of like the closest account you can get. But I always thought it was so interesting how at the height of their fame, the Beatles decided to go to India because it is a very unlikely move almost. It was so new back then, that idea that a band at the height of their fame says, we are not touring anymore and we're just going to go to India for a couple of months and see what comes of it. And I think it is really interesting. And one thing that I feel like is often forgotten when we speak about the Beatles is the fact that they were incredibly young. You just heard it in this video. George celebrated his 25th birthday in India. The Beatles' careers were over before anyone turned 30. Today is August 22nd, and August 22nd is a special day in Beatles history because it's the day, August 22nd, 1962, was when the first picture of the Beatles, the Fab Four with Ringo, was ever taken. And August 22nd, 1969, was the last time there was ever a picture of all four Beatles together taken. I didn't film this intentionally today, it just worked with my schedule. But it's just so important, I think, to understand how young, impressionable, and also still on the lookout for who they were, the Beatles really were back then. That is kind of my age. I'm 26, so I'm about as old as the Beatles were when they went to India. And I truly understand. I feel like it's a very common feeling. I see this in me, I see this in my friends, that you haven't fully figured out who you are. You haven't fully figured out what you want to do with your life. And I think when you are so famous and so at the top of everything, basically, so young, it doesn't make it easier. And so I really understand that they wanted to take some time away from everything to just see what could come of it. And it's also really telling that someone like George had a fully different experience than someone like Ringo, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just interesting to see, and it does, to me, explain a lot and who the Beatles were and how this was so intertwined with their breakup. Because I do truly believe that if Brian Epstein wouldn't have passed, the Maharishi would have never had that much power over them, and maybe things would have come different, but we'll never know. So yeah, I would love to know what you think about all of this. What do you think about the Maharishi, the Beatles in India? Yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video, and if there's anything else in Beatles history you would like me to talk about, leave a comment down below. I would love to make a video. I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would love you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls! Also, when you're seeing this, I'm a week away from my due date. I'm pre-filming all videos because at some point I just want to wind down and be ready for the baby to be here. But follow me on Instagram if you want to have a little more daily updates. But I will share with you once my daughter's here. But yeah, I'll see you. Bye, dolls!